So it seems like every actor in the system is sort of placing the onus or the responsibility on the shoulders of others. And so perhaps just a greater recognition that changes at the margin, so small changes in the way that we do things, can actually have a system-wide effect.
Welcome to this space of conversations with Game Changers.
These meaningful conversations with those who we have found are connected to their purpose from within, who are able to express that purpose in a really unique way, and through that are bringing transformation to the world in different ways.
We are interested in people who aim to change the game and create new narratives that open new possibilities for them and for all of us.
We are Purpose+Motion, and we support organizations to connect with their purpose and then get in motion, in action.
The potential we help them unlock allows them to stabilize through transitions, create healthier work environments, and scale their positive impact in the world.
Enjoy these conversations.
And please let us know what you think in the comments below.
In this series of interviews, we are particularly meeting people from the process which we have been running, Purpose+Motion and Rios Partners, have been running, called Reinventing the International NGO Sector. And today, I'm really glad to have with us Alex Martins, who is an independent researcher, facilitator, advocate, and social entrepreneur. You put in the making, but I believe it's made. Recently co-founded the Equity Index, which we'll speak a little more about, and who is passionate about creating a more equitable international development sector. Alex, thanks so much for being with us.
Thank you for having me.
So what I have been reading up about you, and about in particular the work you've been doing recently, is this focus on equity. It seems to be sort of the passion project you have at the moment. And yeah, to start off, I would love to hear a little what this means to you, what equity means to you, and how did it become your passion or your purpose?
Those are great questions. And yes, indeed, I find these days everything I think about, whether it's COVID-19 unfolding here in London to all of the work I'm doing in the international development sector, the word that keeps coming up is equity. So it's really difficult to define equity in one sentence, but the way that we're approaching it for the Equity Index, which you mentioned in your introduction, is basically to think of it as a general leveling of a very unequal playing field that takes into account historical power imbalances and injustices. And so if we think about the international development system as a sort of, in many ways, unhelpful binary, the old terminology is developed and developing. I have banned those words from my vocabulary. I don't use them. I personally use the terms global south and global north, while recognizing that any binary is problematic, and those terms may also have, connotations that are not necessarily helpful. But I do find that from a global south perspective, that's the terminology that's often used. And so I have adopted it in my personal work. And of course, terminology can change over time. So it'll be interesting to see what comes up next. But this idea of equity, being that there's been this very unequal system where, the global north are the doers and the givers and the saviors, and the global south are the passive recipients and the helpless ones. So even when we use the term beneficiaries, for example, that's a very disempowering, or in what I would call very inequitable language. So, okay, that sounds very highfalutin, but what does equity actually mean? So the more concrete framework we've tried to put around it has a couple of different elements. So I don't think you can talk about equity in the international development sector without talking about racial equity, gender equity, and the intersection. And that isn't to say, and it doesn't mean that other concepts like disability, socioeconomic status aren't important. But I think when we're trying to conceptualize, sort of a more, parsimonious or simple concept, for me, you cannot speak about equity without the racial and equity and the gender equity piece. And we often see there are a lot of indices out there actually that rank gender equality or gender equity, both at an organizational level and at a country level, but none of them talk about race. And when they do reference race, it's in the context of quote unquote diversity and inclusion, or sometimes it's called diversity, equity and inclusion, DEI. And that's absolutely crucial, because that's about, you know, a full spectrum of diversity. But because of the very racialized way in which the international development system was born, and is very much a neo-colonial construct, for me, racial equity has to be at the top of that I guess, consideration. And then gender becomes important when it intersects with race. And then beyond that kind of rather simple, but I think powerful framework, we also have different types of what we call north-south equity, or perhaps universal equity. And I'll just touch very briefly on 4 of them. One is language. We already talked about it. So a lot of the language we use reinforces these power imbalances. So the developing, beneficiary, when we say the field. Often when we use the term local, when we actually mean national, that can be quite disempowering. Whereas some organizations will actually self-define as local. So it's more about using terminology that is equitable based on the context where those, you know, individuals and organizations sit. Knowledge production, I'm a researcher by trade. So, you know, the way knowledge is not only produced, but seen as valuable is a really, really crucial element of inequity. So we see these really high budget research projects completely designed in the North, a lot of the times by exclusively white research teams. And then you go to the field to consult with beneficiaries and collect data. And then you do all of the analysis again back in the global North. So what kind of knowledge are you actually producing, and what is the impact? That can be a huge component of equity. Funding. I mean, despite a grand bargain commitment of 25% of funding going directly to local and national humanitarian organizations, I believe the latest data point is that sits at 3.1%. Yeah, I have a problem with that. I think a lot of people have a problem with that. That's clearly not an equitable funding system, and that's just for humanitarian, completely disregarding development for a moment. And then the final one is equitable partnerships. So how we build, a lot of development and aid, quote unquote, these days is done through procurements. You know, you build a consortium of organizations, you bid for a pot of money from a donor, and then you implement. So partnerships are actually at the heart of also the funding question. How is that partnership built, and how are those funding relationships decided? So is it that the quote unquote prime organization based in the global North takes 95% of the budget and 95% of the decision making, or is there a more equitable structure at play? So that's a very long answer to your question, but I think these sort of 6 dimensions help to put a bit of meat on the bones.
That's a very complete, and yet I'm sure we could go much deeper into that sort of definition of it. And then for me, what would be really interesting is to hear how did you come to this? Why is it so important to you?
Yeah, so I was born in South Africa, but my parents were from Mozambique, so they moved there in the mid-1970s. And at the time, it was still a Portuguese colony. And so I actually have a Portuguese passport. And my entire family is actually, pretty much all of it is in Brazil. In Portugal. The Brazil component comes in. When I was 10, we moved to Brazil, and we actually have also a component of the family that lives there. The rest are in Portugal. And so I guess having this global South upbringing, but that, sort of has that also global North background, and the fact that I self-identify as white, I think all of that, I guess, has combined to the point where my career in development has been in the global North. But because you can tell from my accent, most people think I'm American or Canadian, and I am white. I think that has given me what I call northern passing privilege, which means that I operate in rooms where people think I'm just like them. And in many ways, perhaps that is true. I've studied in global North institutions and worked for global universities and worked for global North institutions, but I do have this entire other side to my identity that isn't necessarily visibly apparent. And so I have been able to witness these issues around inequity up close because, I wasn't seen as someone from South Africa or someone from Brazil, or, was sort of one of them. And I started to actually feel very uncomfortable with the extent to which I was able to just fit into this system. And I felt almost co-opted by it. So the longer I worked in the sector, I felt more and more uncomfortable about what I was seeing on all those dimensions of equity that I talked about, from race all the way to the partnerships. And so then the question became, can you be an insider outsider? Can you work in this sector, but also critique it and reform it? And the honest answer is I didn't know the answer to that question. So I decided to basically become independent, which I've been now for 2.5 years. And then over that time, I thought, well, there has to be maybe maybe a way of working with others on these issues. And that's how kind of the equity index idea was then born. So I'm working with a group of amazing people now who bring all of their different perspectives on equity, because what I think about equity, quite frankly, is not that interesting, and it's also not that robust. It's one perspective, and we need many. So that's sort of a little bit about how I got here. Does that make sense?
For me, what's really interesting in particular of that story is how, in a way, you got a glimpse into a world because people perceived you in a way that you maybe don't perceive yourself, or not wholly perceive yourself. And I find that really interesting aspect that maybe doesn't actually come out so much in the six definitions of equity that you're speaking about, is that very, not only about the conscious and unconscious, but also very much about the emotional and nearly sort of self-perceived, inner worlds of every actor in this, be it the beneficiary, the end user, who all of this is for, apparently, or all of us working in this field.
Yeah.
I mean, equity has so much to do with that inner world in many ways, and the perceived or the experience everyone has. How do you integrate that in your concept of equity?
Oh, that's such a brilliant question, because it's something I've been grappling with, particularly over the last year, is how this concept of bringing your whole self to work. Is it buzzword? Is it real? Is it possible? Is it not? This has been running through my mind for a very long time. But I'll bring it back to the data. I mean, we've been talking to people about the idea for an equity index, and also talking to people about equity longer than that in a personal capacity. And I would say the overwhelming thing that has come up over the last 18 months is that equity is a feeling. Equity is a feeling. And it's so true. If you've been treated inequitably, you just know. You just know. And if you haven't been on the, the kind of that end of the equation, often you don't know. Because if you're walking around the world and being treated equitably, you're not necessarily going to pick up on, oh, I was treated very equitably today. It doesn't, stand out as much as that partnership or that interaction felt inequitable. This partnership feels inequitable. And so then it comes, the question then becomes, okay, we're doing an index. We have to measure this. We have to measure a feeling, And of course, there's so much been written, particularly from other disciplines, about how you do just that, how you measure feelings, attitudes, behaviors, etc. But at the same time, we don't want to, I guess, diminish the concept of equity as a feeling just to certain, metrics. This is where we're going to need to use a lot of qualitative data, and also redefine the concept of what evidence means. Because if we're trying to capture an inner experience, someone's inner world, whether it's ours on the team or the people that we're speaking to, there has to be a more creative way of doing that. I think a lot of people come into international development because they do really care. They do really care about some form of social change. There might be different motivations behind that, but I think it is a sector where people are more willing to bring their whole selves, but perhaps there are structures in place that are preventing us from doing that. I think the reason I'm able to bring more of myself into my work now is because I work independently. I think perhaps if you're in an institution, that could be harder. I think it was harder for me. Might not be true for everyone. But as a sector, let's do more of this. Let's capture the inner world and not, I guess, reduce the idea of feelings and how we operate with each other in this sector just to a couple of very high-level metrics.
Yeah, that's really powerful as well to sort of extrapolate this. Okay, there needs to be metrics in a way, nearly just also to awaken people up to this, to sort of have something concrete to start those discussions. And then it's in a lot of ways about how those discussions happen, right? I mean, if I take the example of what's been happening in the States in the last few months, with the sort of discussion around race really again becoming very important, I was shocked on a very personal level, because there was again a whole number of insights from me in my own life and the way I see myself, the way I see my relations with people of color, people from minorities, which I had never had before. And yet I've always been interested in this, So it's like every time these things come up, there's new thoughts, new insights that come up, and it requires that sort of, as I think you mentioned in a lot of your talk about the equity index, this mirror is needed, so people go, and wake up a bit. So it's sort of increasing a bit of awareness around that. So maybe if you can just give a little bit of explanation about what the equity index is going to be, or is already, because you're working on it, and how you think it's going to help address these issues.
Yeah, great question. And I agree with everything you just said as well. And we'll come back to that at the end of my potted history of the equity index. I mean, essentially what we are is a social enterprise. And that in the UK takes the form of a community interest company. But I think the term social enterprise will be more recognizable, across different country contexts. And we were officially sort of launched in mid-June. And basically we're an organization that is set up to advocate for more equitable policies, practices, and partnerships in the international development sector. We are currently UK focused. And the reason is because not only is equity a feeling, it's also often very context specific. And the UK, with its specific colonial history, that tells a particular story of equity. And so we wanted to focus initially on the UK. That's also where our expertise lies. It would be very difficult for me to comment on equity in the sector in Germany or in the US or other contexts that I'm not familiar with. And so concretely, what we'll be doing is crafting equity-related indicators. We've got two types, internal and external, and they map onto the dimensions I spoke about earlier. So internally, we're going to be looking at things like racial equity, like gender equity, and other dimensions. And then externally, we're going to be looking at the components that we talked about earlier, the funding, the partnerships, all that sort of thing. And so the other component of the index is, hang on a minute, you could say, well, I'm an INGO, I'm an international NGO. And so a lot of these categories don't actually apply to me. Or you could say, I'm a consultancy, and so that category doesn't apply to me, et cetera, et cetera. A think tank could say the same thing. So what we've also done is come up with the concept of, I always get this wrong, vertical and horizontal indicators. Horizontally, you can think of these as your basic bedrock standards. So what are all of the things that an international development organization in the UK who works internationally, including in the Global South, what are the basic minimum standards that they need to be adhering to when it comes to equity? But then vertically, that's when we can recognize, okay, well, if you are a donor, maybe these dimensions of equity are more applicable or are more within your control. If you're a consultancy, they might be this. If you're a think tank, they might be that. And so putting all of this together, we're going to create an index that will basically will be very transparent and publish all of the data that we gather against these indicators. And then we're experimenting with different ways in terms of how we kind of rank the different organizations. So that's what we'll be doing. And right now, very excitingly, we got some funding to do a pilot project. Because at the end of the day, everything I've just outlined is theoretical, right? We don't actually know how it works in practice. So I think it's really, really important that you test and build, right? Or build and test and build, fail and learn and fail, all of that stuff. We're trying to incorporate that type of adaptive thinking. And so the pilot is with specifically the UK consultancy sector. So I think in the US, that term is, the term contractors is used a bit more, but it's basically private sector actors from very specialized all the way up to corporate actors that receive official development assistance money to implement projects in the Global South. And so that will be where we start.
And is this a collaborative endeavor with those who are being indexed in a sense, or is it you guys sort of drawing what knowledge you can from public information, basically?
Yeah, it's a good question, because this is something we're going to test as part of the pilot. It has to be something that isn't too burdensome, because then otherwise organizations will disengage. But we also want to be able to get nuanced data that tells a really good story. So I think in answer to your question, it'll be a little bit of both. But this is where I'm very fortunate and couldn't have done this without partnering with Laurianne Robinson. So she is the director of the advocacy team, which is an advocacy consultancy for the UK development sector, but she's worked all over the world. And this is something that she'll be leading on, is how do you conduct a robust and impactful advocacy strategy once we've got this data? Because at the end of the day, an index for an index's sake is not very interesting to any of us. We want to see the change, we want to see more equitable practices, equitable policies, practices, and partnerships spreading across the sector.
Totally, and that actually makes me think of, a lot of what we do as consultants is exactly this sort of thing, without necessarily the public element of it. But to go in and do an evaluation of an organization often ends up either being an extractive process, or, and this is something we've come to in the last few years, is it when it's extractive, it generally has no impact. When it's a sort of work with the organization, and the more it's work with an organization, indeed when it's a self-evaluation mostly, that already starts a change happening simply by doing that. And there's obviously the caveats of then, self-reporting is obviously more positive, or often more positive. It can also be more self-flagellating, but there's obviously those caveats. But that's an approach that for us always brings change through the process itself, and then leads to many things we never even imagined before. So I was wondering, as you were saying, there's advocacy is an intention. What else do you think is needed other than the index itself for this change to start happening in organizations?
Yes, thank you for that question, because I forgot to say something I always say when I talk about the equity indexes. I mean, this is a 1% solution. There are hopefully no delusions of grandeur on our part. This is just an index. And so it goes back to what you're talking about. Yes, putting the mirror up so we face ourselves. Lorianne always talks about putting a spotlight on ourselves in the sector. We're so used to measuring them over there and those people over there, not us. So it's kind of the looking internally to then work more effectively externally. But it is only a part of the kind of the much bigger story. And we also are very clear, you cannot be all things at the same time. Equity is not the same thing as justice. It just isn't. If you were to adopt a justice lens, so, you would take a completely different approach. And there are lots of organizations out there, feminist, anti-racist, organizations and movements that are doing this work. So for us, the equity index could sort of provide, I guess, put data in the hands of others that can then take that forward and advocate across the sector. But I think having a more equitable sector is definitely step one. So we're trying to operate within the confines of the existing system. But of course, there are many great thinkers in the development sector who say the system as a whole is broken and needs a complete reimagining, or reinventing. So it's trying to balance those different processes. But if change is on a spectrum, we're sort of working with what we have now. And I think if we do have greater equity, that is a step potentially along the path towards greater justice. Because in theory, perfect equity is equality. Who's going to be perfect? Who's going to be perfect at this right away? Nobody, including ourselves, by the way. We're going to be ranking ourselves. We're going to be measuring ourselves. Because how do you create an equitable organization from day one? We're acting as though it's easy. It's absolutely not. And then the final thing I'll say is, the equity index is not an oracle. We are not, at least I don't want us to be perceived as an oracle. We talk about this internally as a team, is that this is a very multifaceted way of looking at equity, but it doesn't encapsulate everything. And we are not the experts. We're working alongside everybody else, trying to do the same things and trying to operate equitably ourselves.
Brilliant. And I think that for me, it's already a massive change, is that you are trying to do to yourselves what many, try and do to others. So create this thing outside when they're not doing it internally. Yeah? What is it that you would want people to do with that index internally, in their organizations? How can they then bring change to their organizations?
Yeah, this is where the rubber hits the road, isn't it? I think acknowledging the fact that inequity is baked into the system. So it's a process of acknowledgement. I think equity, it's funny, the Black Lives Matter movement has been around for a very long time. And yet it suddenly took on a new life and added new momentum to the point where it's affected how the international development sector is talking about race, talking about impact of a movement. I mean, it's unbelievable. Because I'll tell you, when we first started talking about the equity index externally to people, well over a year and a half ago, I sensed that the part that people were perhaps nervous about was the racial equity component, and also even the term equity, because how often do we really use that term? Equity is almost always in our evaluation frameworks, in our donor frameworks, the concept of equity is always about an intervention. So it's an over there, not an in here concept. So we had to do a lot of different things. We had to introduce this term as something different, as an internally focused thing. We had to talk about, issues that nobody else in the sector was already talking about, And so all of those things combined have meant that we've had a momentum behind us that we didn't expect to have. So I think a part of what we were hoping to start with has already happened, which is organizations doing that acknowledgement piece. I don't think, I said this in another interview, but I think any organization can write a Black Lives Matter statement. But what we want to see a year from now is, have you done what you committed to doing? And you asked what else they could do. I think just commit to a reflective practice. This is not easy work. And I do it on a personal level. So we've talked about how the Equity Index, we aspire to be an anti-racist and a feminist organization. Well, again, anyone can use those words. Anyone can even write out what they mean, but it's how you live it on a daily basis. So, my personal anti-racism practice is just that. It's a commitment to doing something differently every day in how I perhaps view things, the content I consume, whose voices I listen to and amplify. Each person and each organization would look at that differently. But just by starting with an internal recognition, and then also, put actual funding and commitments behind these things. They don't happen overnight, and don't be discouraged if you're not making loads of progress right away. Just stick with it, and then in a year we'll see. Maybe in a year the landscape looks very different, and we can move up to a different level.
Yeah, I really sense that what you're bringing being part of the solution, and yet you really see, all the maybe even much more difficult work that's needed on an internal level. And I guess, so that's for each organization. And then for me, there's this question of on a systemic level, right? We're talking about reinventing the INGO system or a sector. What's needed at that level for more equity?
I don't know, Mike. I don't know. Obviously, our theory of change is that you have organizational level change to contribute to systems change. But in practice, I think I guess the part that I'll focus on is the interconnectedness. So how, a lot of INGOs will say, well, I wanted to do it this way, but the donor wouldn't let me. And then the donor will say, well, I wanted to, but we have legislation in place that prevents me from doing so. Or we're responding to public demand in our own country, the taxpayer. In the UK, we talk a lot about the UK taxpayer, because ultimately that's where the development budget comes from, or the official development assistance budget comes from. So it seems like every actor in the system is sort of placing the onus or the responsibility on the shoulders of others. And so perhaps just a greater recognition that changes at the margin, so small changes in the way that we do things, can actually have a system-wide effect. So for example, there's a huge body of work around how we do grant making differently, funding. Huge amounts of reform going on there, and that could trigger a whole chain reaction. Because if you think about it as a supply chain, starting with the donor, and obviously this only applies to certain parts of the sector, but if a particular funding practice were to change, that could ignite something all along the chain and then all the way back up. So if an innovation is introduced and it actually has real impact and it's sent back up the chain, and then maybe it goes out to different nodes, that's how I could see, from our slightly more narrow, view of it, that's how I could see certain things potentially reaching that more systemic level. But it's very difficult because I think we live in an inequitable world generally. So if you take COVID, for example, could this be a catalyst for something for greater equity? I don't know, because even look at what's happening in the UK. The inequities have been exposed and they're worsening. So that sounds very pessimistic now, but I think a huge change like COVID combined with these smaller changes at the margin could lead us somewhere interesting.
Yeah, and I like the focus on the interconnectedness, absolutely, that there's even small changes, in a way a bit like a virus. A virus can just spread here and there, and it can actually have a huge impact, much larger than the actual impact of this virus. And that's somewhat what we are aiming to do with this process, is really, infuse a few people with some new ideas, new thinking, new connections, and then see how that ripples out. So let's keep that conversation going and keep those ripples going. And thanks so much for taking the time today to be with us and to share this amazing work you're doing.
Thank you. And as we say this all the time, but we'd love people to get in touch and give us feedback. You know, what can we do differently? What can we do better? We're trying to learn. This is a whole new way of working for us.
Wonderful. Thanks, Alex.